373. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first session, the first big idea session for the very first online LX conference. Thank you all for coming along. You made it. We've been saying this is the first online LX conference, which is true because we've actually got, there are some LX designers in the Netherlands who have been organizing a face-to-face one, which they held last year, and then they've done another one this year. But we were very keen to connect with everyone and couldn't travel to the Netherlands. So we set up an online one also to make it more accessible for everyone. And we're just really, really pleased because it was a bit of a gamble for us, but we're really pleased at how many people have shown an interest and to know that this LX thing is real and you're all really interested. So that's great. Most of you have found it, but our conference hub is located at lxconf.co, and if you're on Twitter and you're participating there, then our hashtag is LXConf. And we really have got people from all around the world, not just our speakers, but also our participants, which is great. We'll be updating our Google map with where everyone is. But if you want to just pop into the chat window where you're from, and maybe what time it is, because I know some people are up very late, then just pop it in there. Just a little bit, people have been saying things like, oh, can't wait for it to get started tomorrow, etc. But despite the amazing array of big idea speakers that we've got, this conference is also for you to share your work. So you don't have to wait for the speaker sessions to come around. You can actually participate and share your work in various ways. Just getting a little bit of feedback from someone. If you're coming in, then just mute your microphone by using the mute button at the top of the page. And so we've got open studio sessions, which you can participate in like two different ways. On the one hand, we've got some live sessions set up, and there will be one right after Indi's presentation. And then we've also got open studio projects, which is a more asynchronous way for you to share your work. You can create a new project, you can share the work that you've been doing, and you can get feedback from everyone. So there are different ways for you to participate in the conference. And then I just want to mention that we've got Kemi Yona, who will be on after the Open Studio, and also Dr. Yeshai Moore later today, which will be the afternoon for you in Europe. And of course, we've also got the conference hallways. People always say that the hallways are where the best conversations happen during conferences. So we've set up virtual hallways, which you can use, and we encourage you to use to catch up with each other. Oh, poor Indi. And some of you have already been getting quite competitive in the introduction forum. We'd like for all of you to really kind of get to know each other as well. And so we've launched a badge competition through which you can introduce yourself to everyone. So we've been getting quite a few fun submissions through that. So the way that oh dear, poor Indi. The way that these sessions are going to work is that we have a big idea speaker, and all of these sessions will have the opportunity for you to pose some questions before. So in this case, we've already got 2 questions that were submitted on our speaker page. You can kind of collect your questions here during the session, and then you'll have the opportunity at the end of Indi's presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes to actually ask Indi some of those questions. And then, of course, there is the opportunity for us to all continue the conversation over the next few days. So we've got the questions from the speaker page, we've got the questions here in the room, and we'll use the hand raise option for that. And then if you want to post some questions from Twitter, then that might be another way to go. Okay, so with that, I would like to introduce our first big idea speaker, and in fact, the very first speaker that I reached out to once we made the decision to organize the LX conference. Indi Young is absolutely one of my UX heroes. I've only been exploring in the UX and service design space for about 2 or 3 years, but she's one of the first authors that I found, and I've read her book multiple times. I'd hold it up, but I've got it as an ebook. So it's on my iPad. But Indi is an independent data scientist and a researcher and an author and the co-founder of Adaptive Path. And if you haven't found their resources yet, you will, because they are absolutely beautiful, but more importantly, be very, very useful. Probably my favorite book of yours, Indi, is Practical Empathy, which I've read several times. And those people who've heard me speak about LX design will know that in every single workshop or presentation I do, I always use your quote about empathy. So I'm a bona fide fan.
Yay!
Yay! So I'm going to give it over to Indi. I just want to let you know that Indi's publisher, Roosevelt Media, have got a whole array of books, not just by Indi, but also by other service design and UX experts. And they've been really kind to sponsoring the conference, and they're giving 20% off if you use the conference code LXConf, so that you can buy Indi's book, but you can also buy other books. And they are also sponsoring the giveaways that we are giving away for things like the badge competition. Okay, so with that, I'm going to give it over to Indi. And Indi, I will switch over your slides, and then I'll make you a presenter.
That sounds awesome. And by the way, I recorded Practical Empathy, and it's available on Audible as well, for those of you who would prefer to listen to it while doing something else.
Okay, Indi, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Joyce. I'm so pleased to be here. Not really that familiar with the education sphere. So I'm kind of going to come at this from my own background. Hopefully, a lot of the concepts that I'll use will apply. I think they will. But it's also totally possible that I'll say some things that may have to do more with the environment that I find myself working in. Being closer to Silicon Valley, I work with a bunch of startups, which have all sorts of difficulties, as well as idealistic people. And I also work with a lot of very large companies and some international companies that have small or sometimes larger innovation teams within them. So with that, let's get started. One of those people that I was working for was an airline. And in the course of our work, I saw some data kind of like this. This is not their data. I had to make it up. You know, you can't tell the secrets of the clients. But this is fairly similar to what we saw, which was the number of passengers in a day and how many of them had checked a bag. And then it was broken down by gender and by age range, and then a little bit by whether it was a business trip or a personal trip, depending on who was willing to fill out a survey. And I took a look at that, and the other people on the user experience team were kind of like, oh yeah, okay, how can we work with this? And I sort of said, well, wait a minute, we're stumbling on a very, very basic assumption. And that is, why break it down in this way? I would rather see it broken down by the thinking styles of the different people rather than their age range, so to speak. I'm not the only one who talks about assumptions. I've written an article in Interactions magazine, it was about a year ago, February, about assumptions. Karen Armstrong, she's also an outspoken person talking about assumptions. And she said this thing, I think it was in one of her TED Talks or an interview about a TED Talk, where she was kind of comparing it to getting a buzz from she said like a drink or maybe from caffeine or something. There's just some sort of frisson. It's like, oh yeah, you know, that's how men think. And it's just something that we as humans find ourselves doing. And what I want us to do is be a little bit more mindful about the fact that correlation is not causation. If you haven't run across this website, you are going to want to go look. This is, it's called Spurious Correlations. The guy went through, I think he stopped posting in about 2012, but for a number of months there, he was finding numeric correlations and posting them in graphic format like this, saying, hey, wow, this is excellent. The divorce rate in Maine is going down because the per capita consumption of margarine is going down. So like, haha, great. And this was really sort of a demonstration of the human tendencies. Like, oh, look, the numbers look the same, therefore they're causing each other to change in this way. Correlation is not causation. We all learned this in university. And yet when I go out into the field, people forget it, or aren't as mindful of it and kind of fall into that rut. And everybody that I work with is extremely talented, very intelligent. And so it's always kind of a awakening session when we're starting to look at things and we're slowing our thinking down a little bit about what it is that we're making our decisions based on. And that's my whole sort of purpose, is to help people slow down in the right way and be a lot more mindful about the decisions that they're making and the audiences, the various audiences that they're making them for, and perhaps make different decisions for different audiences. And at the root of that, which is at the root of my books, understand those audiences a lot better. So let's go back to this breakdown. I'm like, okay, well, I break it down by female and male. You know, I think one of the teammates was like, oh yeah, you know, the women check a whole lot more bags because they've got more makeup and shoes, right? Anyway, we actually did do some research on this. I did about 14 months worth of research with this team, which was fantastic. Not something I get to do with a lot of people. Usually people are trying to speed things along. They've stolen budget from somewhere to be able to do this on the QT, or they somehow convinced the right manager to do it, and all the stars were aligned. And we only have this little window to do it in. And so in our research, we found that we saw people checking bags and not checking bags for certain reasons. These were just some of the reasons. They're not all of them. But over on the left, I'm not checking in a bag because there was a group of people who are like, distrust. I've gotten bags back. One guy said he had powder on his bag twice when he got it back off of the carousel. And this was right after the anthrax scare in the US. So he's all like, Another one is several of them talked about their bags getting thrashed, wheels being broken off, etc. Also very prominent were the people who are like, you know, this thing that I'm carrying is very important to me. One man was carrying a medical laser device for eyes to donate or take to a medical facility in Nepal. He's all like, I don't want to let the gorillas, he said this, I don't want to let the gorillas get a hold of that. It would be out of calibration by the time I got there. Another guy, he was a musician and he had his guitar with him. He's going to carry that on. Indeed, there are some people, musicians who do cellos or something with a big instrument, and they actually buy a seat on the plane for their instrument. On the right-hand side, there are people who check their bags, and the thinking went kind of more along the lines of like, oh, you know, there's something that I've got that's not going to go through security. One gal was coming back from a business trip that happened to be in Belgium, and no way was she not coming back with Belgian beer. And she's like, that's not going through security. I have to check my bag. There are other people's mindset, kind of the thinking style was like, I don't want to have to be bothered with my luggage in my connecting airport. Maybe I had broken my leg and I was like temporarily disabled. I didn't want to drag it around. Or maybe, you know, I travel all the time and I know that things are in place for me, that if something happens to my luggage, I can deal with it for my business trip. And I'd rather just not have to lug it around the airport. So this is, like I said, just a sampling of the different thinking styles. These thinking styles cross age, they cross gender, they cross even the kind of business trip it was. I mean, the kind of trip, whether it was a business trip or a vacation or, you know, some sort of an emergency trip to see family or something. So it really didn't have anything to do with the demographics. And in fact, one of the jokes that I like to say when I was looking at this, I told them, if we're going to break it down by all these spurious correlations, let's figure out how many glasses of alcohol that they ordered while on board, right? Maybe that has a bearing on it. It's just, totally ridiculous the way that we're looking at it that way. So the idea is to become a little bit more mindful. Here, I redid this, and now we're breaking it down by people's thinking styles. And by looking at thinking styles, and thinking styles aren't perfect either, but by looking at thinking styles, now we're getting a little bit deeper into what really might be differences that we could support in different ways. So there might be different thinking styles that we can offer support for, that when a passenger comes up against it, they'll say, oh yeah, that's me. I'm going to take advantage of this kind of support because it's what I need, as opposed to just having, one way of checking bags. So I think a lot of the companies that I work with, and probably a lot of academic institutions, subscribe to this whole science is, and numbers is going to guide us. So we want to be smart. We want to understand our customer needs. We want to be data-driven. And somehow the data-driven and understanding customer needs gets hitched together. And I'm going to show you how to break it apart so that it doesn't have anything to do with being data-driven. And in fact, I'm going to offer you a different phrase. I'm going to have all sorts of phrases for you guys to be a little bit more mindful about. Instead of, when you hear that word data-driven, you might want to offer the idea of data-informed. This is a friend of mine, Sean Davis, who works at Microsoft, did a TED Talk about this idea. He also used the spurious correlations example. So the idea is to say, hey, we're not going to have these numbers decide things for us, but the numbers can inform us, and the qualitative data can inform us as well. So the next piece of vocabulary that I want to introduce is this idea of user. I don't know how many of you use the word user. You might use the word, in academics, you might use the word student. You might use the word faculty. You might use the word that describes the person that's interacting with your organization. This user, or whatever other word you use in place of user, if it's a person who has a relationship to your organization, that's a particular kind of person. That is a perfectly good time to use that word. But when I want to find out about people, I want to find out about them and about their thinking without any respect to the relationship that they have to your organization. So I call them people. They're a person. I want to find out about them. I don't call them users. And I'm very mindful about when I start using the word user or any of the equivalent words. So what I'm trying to say is going to be a little bit more clear when I get to a diagram a little bit farther from here. But part of it is that when you say the word user needs, you're automatically framing your thinking with respect to your organization and your solution that you offer to people. And that gets us into a lot of trouble, and it gets us into very boxed thinking. So instead of user needs, well, I shouldn't say instead of, because there is a point in time when you want to understand user needs, very specifically people who have a relationship to your organization. But what I'd like to do is add to this picture person's purpose. So can customers help us come up with features is valid. It's something that you want to do. But in addition to that, what I want to know is, what are we blind to? Where are those assumptions that are so pernicious? So let me talk about the idea of solution space versus problem space. I don't know if you've heard of it, so I'm going to sort of introduce it from a low level. You may have heard of, if you've ever been in software design or involved in any sort of digital design, you may have heard of this loop called think, make, check, or you may have heard of it called the ideas, the design, and the delivery. And it loops and it loops. And as we go through it, we stop and evaluate what we're doing with actual users. I'm using that word specifically here. So we check with users to see if our ideas make sense. We check with users to see if our design makes sense. We check with users once we've delivered something to see if it needs to be fixed. And then we go back through and we do more ideas, we do more design, we need more evaluation. Laura Klein has written a book for product managers called UX for Lean Startups. And the product managers are the one who they're very much in charge of this solution cycle. And what she's saying is, hey, you need to really validate your ideas before you go on to design. Prior to her writing about this, people would only think of evaluation with respect to testing a design. And so what she's doing is calling out the idea separately. The idea is a different mind space. When you're thinking about innovative solutions, when you're thinking about closing gaps, when you're thinking about trying on different approaches for different audience thinking styles, those are the ideas that you're coming up with, and you haven't yet made designs out of them. Those ideas merit validation. So here is that cycle back again, where I'm kind of pointing out, look, design is starting to form at the end of ideas and the beginning of design. At the end of design and the beginning of delivery, the design has taken form. These are two different things. Now, if you are working in design exclusively, this should all make sense to you. This is where you'll do participatory design. You'll probably do it at both the ideas and the design level. This is where you will do your usability testing. This is where you will work with your team who's going to try to prototype it. So also, when I mentioned the word participatory, I want to introduce the idea of generative. So there's evaluative research, which involves getting users in to sort of evaluate what you've done and give you some feedback. But generative is another way of getting users in to help you come up with ideas, help you come up with the design and play around with it. So here I've put those into the diagram as well. And at this point, you may note that the whole right side of the screen is completely blank. And I'm going to fill that in for you in a moment. How many people have heard of design thinking? That is something that's come out of IDEO. I'm not sure how widespread. Oh, we've got some yeses. This is good. It starts with this idea of empathizing, with this idea of understanding the people you're trying to create ideas for. Look, they have that ideate section in their cycle, and then design or prototype for. So they have those same things. They start with the empathize. And this is the idea of trying to understand people instead of just taking those numbers and saying, oh, let's break it down by male and female, right? And go with the spurious correlation. So what I am trying to do is point out that making empathy a part of the product or design cycle faces problems, the problems that it faces in the world that I work in, and probably not as much in your world, is the problem of time. When you are working as a product manager in one of these companies, you are faced with speed, I guess. Speed is a goal, speed is worshipped. Try to do things fast. Facebook used to have a motto called move fast and break things. When they said break things, they didn't realize that it could be interpreted in a different way than just breaking the code. They just meant, oh, let's break the code. And so the code doesn't work anymore. And that's a very engineering way of thinking of it. But things can break for people's experiences too. And I've got some books that I highly recommend that talk about specific experiences to Facebook where things broke. And I'm sure you guys have all of your own experiences and articles that you've read about that. So what I'm advocating is let's separate it out. it shouldn't be a part of the speed issue, because when it gets to be a part of that speed, agile, lean, anything to do with the product cycle, it tends to get kicked out. It tends to get smushed down into the tiniest amount of time. I have had entrepreneur after entrepreneur say, oh, well, we're just going to go spend the afternoon out in the neighborhood talking to people about this. And they call it good. And they call talking to somebody for 5 or 10 minutes understanding them. And that's not true, at least not in most cases, and not the way that they're pulling it off. So really what they're trying to do in the neighborhood is evaluate. They're taking a prototype out and they're trying to get feedback. So this is something to be very mindful about. When you're trying to understand people, you're not validating your ideas with them. You may not even be generating ideas, although understanding people's it'll come along with doing generative work. When you're truly just trying to understand people, you are purely taking it in. It's called listening. So in the people cycle, the one that cycles around people, not users, it starts with listening. You develop empathy from there, and then you find patterns. And then maybe you can listen some more because some of these patterns are interesting to you. And then you develop more empathy and you find more patterns. And there's this idea of the problem space and the solution space that has been broached in the product managing world. This guy, Dan Olson, talks about it in his book. He still splits that one development cycle, though. He tries to split it into problem and solution. What I like to do is split the two cycles. So you cannot explore what they're calling the problem space, what I'm calling, understanding people very deeply and understanding their thinking styles. You can't understand it as a speedy part of that solution space. Sure, it can be touched upon. And sure, there might be places where the solution space is proceeding at a mindful pace. I have not ever encountered one of those. But they could exist. They could exist in academia. That is a place where there is more mindfulness and also a lot more debate, shall we say, I have heard. Anyway, this is what I like to see. Split it up. An analogy is if you're, say, an advertising company or even a company like IDEO that specializes in creating brand new ideas and innovations and innovative design, to make it a part of that cycle is going to fail. But if you have that ongoing cycle that moves slowly, doesn't have to happen all the time. You can do it once a year even, or once every 5 years. Go out and dig into the people that you're trying to support and understand them much deeper. If you're an IDEO, you understand who your clients are, and you can do this research as a way of supporting those potential clients, bringing in new clients and saying, hey, we've got all this information about these end people that we're trying to support. Okay, so the way that it attaches is by this idea, this spark, where you're trying to do some innovation, where you're trying to do some strategizing about which direction to take different parts of your offerings, where you're trying to close gaps or strengthen different parts of your offerings for specific audience segments. And this is the point where I want to introduce the idea of behavioral audience segments. You could call them personas, and I'm fine with calling them personas, but personas has historically run into the speed problem, and people just sit around a room in an afternoon and make up their personas instead of actually gathering data and doing some analysis and looking for the patterns. So you get some personas that aren't so helpful. Behavioral audience segments is my way of talking about it from the perspective of depth and getting the thinking style, like I was talking about with the way that you may decide to check luggage, capturing that as opposed to just quickly sketching out demographically even who you're trying to support. This other item that I have in here is called a mental model diagram. And that is my way of looking at the way people are doing their reasoning, the way that they're having reactions, the decisions they're making based on all of this, and their guiding principles that have built up over time, taking all of that and mapping it out. And then aligning the way that you support people with that and seeing what gaps there are, seeing which audience segments you're supporting the best, which audience segments you're leaving behind, and being able to get a much better handle on the future of where you could take your organization and how you could offer better support for the people you're trying to help. Okay, so I've added a couple of little notes here because in my book, Practical Empathy, I refer to that develop empathy part as simmering. There's a lot of depth that goes into this, and I can't do justice to it all in a 1-hour talk, but at least I can introduce the ideas and give you references so that if you're interested in any of this, or it might help make an argument within your own area, you'll have the materials to do that. Okay, so essentially, just to reiterate, all of our work is being done with a focus on the solution. We're not really looking at the actual intent or purpose that someone has, which is being referred to as the problem space. It's not like someone has a problem. Maybe they're doing just fine, checking their bags. It's not necessarily a problem, but that's the way that it's referred to. I like to refer to it as intent or purpose. Okay, so this is where we're getting into trouble. And this is where I want to try to give people a way out. Okay, so let me touch really quickly on this idea of a variety of kinds of research. You saw on that diagram that I talked about evaluative research and a lot of variety of ways you can do evaluative research. There's also generative research. There's many ways to do generative research, including participatory design. And all of it has to do with that solution, or at least that's the way I see it happening in the world that I've been familiar with or had experience with. Problem space is another layer. And this is the place where we get to be a little more calm and a little more deep and take a little bit more time to really understand what's going on, to really spend time with people and listen and try to get our head around what they're facing in terms of the intent that they have, or the purpose they're trying to fulfill. Okay, so here's an example. On the left, we've got a solution. Clients will say, well, how do people see our brand? How is our new offering doing? Whereas purpose is very person-focused. Like a person might say, I'm determined to change my career, or I must keep up with my field, or maybe I'm collaborating with somebody in a different field and I kind of need the basics of their field to participate better and be a better collaborator with them. These would both be two sides of what was formerly known as a publishing company. In fact, Rosenfeld Media was asking these solution questions at one point several years ago. And so then we started discussing these other purpose questions and maybe gathering some data around those. Okay, so we want to be both solution framed and purpose framed. I think we've, as a industry, we've done pretty well at the solution framed. I'm introducing the idea of the purpose framed or the problem space area. Okay. This is just sort of a continuation of that. I'm going to move on to this idea of support. You guys may have noticed that I have said the word support, like, I don't know, you go back in the transcript and count 20 times. And there's a reason for that. I want to help people in terms of what they make and in terms of how they act in support of people. But when I did the research for my book about practical empathy, I noticed that a lot of the literature out there was focused on persuading. Persuading is not supporting necessarily. There was also a lot of talk about it in terms of politics, maybe trying to convince somebody to vote a different way. And there's also a lot of it in the area of trying to get people to click on ads, or trying to get people to buy things that they hadn't intended to buy, or trying to get people to do something that wasn't their original intent. And that's called manipulation. There can be positive manipulation, but most of it is referred to as dark patterns. There's a list apart article about dark patterns if you want to go look at that. There's also a website out there, darkpatterns.org now, where they're trying to collect some of it. The bright patterns that I've seen often occur in healthcare, maybe where you're trying to help someone quit smoking or something like that. Now, of course, they're going to have an intent to try to get healthier, and so you're supporting that intent. So it isn't a perfect example of a bright pattern. But I noticed that in all this literature, this idea was very prevalent of persuading. And in fact, Daniel Goleman, who has written the book about emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, he says, this is, it means that anything that has to do with cognitive empathy leads to hustling, where hustling is that dark pattern manipulation kind of stuff. Another thing that I noticed when I was doing my research was kind of this idea of encouraging growth and maturity, which does happen in the education field. Being able to help students understand that there is a wide variety of perspectives out there, and accept that variety has a role to play in everybody's lives. But this third thing down, this is the one that I'm very, very interested in. And that is in supporting the intents and purposes of other people. And so that is where I'm focused. Oftentimes I will see people say, oh, well, we do support the tasks of somebody, or we do support the goals. These are sort of those user needs. And the user needs are all very framed by the solution, by the organization and what the organization provides. Intents and purposes is slightly larger than that. The intents and purposes are things like, I want to take mom to the Grand Canyon while we still can. A task might be book a flight. A goal might be take the trip to the Grand Canyon. But a lot of people go to the Grand Canyon with different purposes. Here, I want to take my mom to the Grand Canyon because she's never been. She's always wanted to go. And she lives in a different city than I do. And so I thought, well, I'm going to look into it. So we would both have to fly to get there. You've probably seen one of these interfaces where the reservation is the only thing that you're faced with. You can't figure out, well, gosh, how could I get my mom and me to the Grand Canyon without undue stress? Because I don't want my mom to have to go through a connecting airport. Last time she did that, she got lost. I also don't want her to have to wait around for me. I want to arrive first and be there so that I can be at her gate. So I'm looking to reduce stress. Now, as somebody who's maybe meeting a group of girlfriends there, college buddies or something, that wouldn't be their purpose, right? So I have multiple purposes at different levels, and it's important to understand these things. Of course, this is a first world problem that I'm giving, but this is equally true at everything that somebody has as a purpose. This is the tiniest, highest level bit of the research that I did with the airline company. And as you can see, one of those where the red arrow is all about exploring what it takes to get to that destination. And every single passenger talked about it. And yet you go to a website and all you get is the reservations. Oh, here, book a flight. And this is how much it costs. It's like, well, no, I kind of want to figure out how. And once you book a flight, once you even get to the figure where you're like, okay, I've gone back and forth for like 3 hours now trying to figure this out by, typing in possibilities or exploring kayak or whatever. Now I think I know what makes sense. Let's go find out how much it costs. Then there's no way to sort of like make it happen for 2 or 3 of you coming from different locations. They completely dropped the ball on that. And this is such an easy thing to support, such an easy thing for them to support. Okay, so let's talk about the word empathy. And I had talked to Joyce earlier. I often poll my audiences, what does the word empathy mean to you? And this is super important because empathy itself is sort of under attack right now. There's a book out called Against Empathy. And I think it's under attack because there are many, many, many definitions of empathy. I was kind of shocked. I kind of like this poor dog, right? the treadmill. We may think we know what the dog is feeling, but many, many definitions of empathy. Sometimes it could be emotion, it could be feelings, it could be walking in someone's shoes. And a lot of people will say, yeah, it's being able to walk in someone else's shoes. That's called perspective taking. And it is a type of empathy, but oftentimes it gets done incorrectly too. And people will say, well, if I were in their shoes, I would blah, blah, blah. And that's not what we mean by walking in their shoes. We mean actually acting like an actor does, that other person's character. It's not putting yourself in their shoes and acting the way you would act. It's thinking their thoughts, having their reactions, and following their guiding principles. So that's what walking in shoes means. So how do you do that? You listen. And the thing that I find that's missing everywhere I go is that people want to apply empathy, and they do it based on make-believe. They do it based on what's in their own experience, what's in the experience of the people in the room with them, and they have no idea what other people think. What are those other thinking styles? What are those other guiding principles? What are other people doing in terms of reasoning? Even if you don't agree with it, you need to know it. You might want to support it. The only way to find that out, because we don't have telepathy servers yet, is to develop empathy by listening. So this is the section of the cycle called Develop Empathy. Let me quickly introduce another kind of, there's actually two kinds of empathy that I'm really interested in. Affective empathy, which is the psychological word for emotional. Emotional empathy is something we can call it. If you guys have seen Pixar's Inside Out movie, you will see the character Sadness sort of demonstrating emotional empathy by sitting down with the character who has lost something and sort of commiserating with them. And that gives that character sort of validation, and that character can then go on with whatever the quest was that they were working on. Emotional empathy sometimes can be like lightning. It's what allows you to understand a character in a book or in a movie. And like lightning, it's extremely powerful, it's extremely illuminating, but it's kind of hard to harness. It's sometimes hard to make it happen. Emotional empathy in the work that I do is supporting, there's that word again, supporting another person through an emotional process, real time. And this is what I use when I'm doing a listening session, because we are emotionally trying to establish trust. We're trying to establish rapport. I'm trying to establish support for that person so that we can then go deep into the thinking that they do and the philosophies that they follow. The other one that I'm super interested in is that cognitive empathy that Daniel Goleman was bad-mouthing, only because he only thinks of the persuasion use of it. So cognitive empathy is consciously cultivating an understanding, a very deep understanding of other people's perspectives. It's really understanding their inner voice as they try to accomplish that intent or that purpose. There are those words again, okay? The intent or purpose. And it's larger. Remember the Grand Canyon story? I'm not just going to the Grand Canyon. I'm trying to take my mom so she'll have a memory. I try to get so deep that the work I do could be asked of people who were my great-grandmother or great-grandfather. These are actually pictures people have sent me of their great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers. They're rare to find pictures, actually, because photography wasn't super prevalent then. So anyway, this is kind of valuable to have these photographs. But the idea is to sort of, bring that idea that it's just a human thing. It's a human thing. It's been going on for centuries. It's not something that's tied to a smartphone, right? Just because we have this thing doesn't mean that our thinking has changed. Just because, likewise, we've turned 50 years old doesn't mean our thinking has changed. Our experiences have changed. We're facing different life events, but our philosophies are probably the same. Okay, so in your work, cognitive empathy is supporting another person in achieving their purpose. And this is what I want your organization to be able to do better and more mindfully. Okay, so the reliability of words, these are some arguments you guys may face. People are all like, oh, quantitative is the only thing I can trust. Qualitative is the other end of that spectrum. No, they're two different spectrums. They both have a wishy-washy end and a very solid end. Also, and actually Dr. Brene Brown talks about the solid end of qualitative. So you may want to check out some of her talks. Also, people will say, oh, well, wait, words are open to interpretation. They're wild. Well, yeah, they are when you talk only at the surface level. When you go to a deeper level in your conversation, then you can start to find some patterns and you can find some reliability. So surface is defined as your opinions, your preferences, explanations of how things work in your life, and statements of fact about your life. This is how we have most of our conversations day to day with our family, with our friends, with our coworkers. It's kind of startling. I've gotten to the point now where as people are talking, I'm all like, statement of facts, statement of facts, statement of fact. Oh, there's an opinion, statement of fact, statement of fact. And then, oh, look, she's starting to talk about why, like how her reasoning goes, what her reaction was. Now we're getting into some depth. And this is what I try to encourage when I'm trying to develop empathy with someone. I try to go deeper. Okay, so this is a little image from my book, the idea of cutting through the ice. Or Dave Gray has a book out called Liminal Thinking. That means threshold thinking. And he also has another way of talking about this. He talks about it as being a bubble that everybody has kind of around them. Your beliefs, you're framed as your opinions and your preferences, your statements of fact. Those are the things that form the bubble that you use to interact with the world around you. And it isn't until you pierce that bubble and you get deeper or get underneath the ice layer that you start to really understand someone. So here's my Brene Brown slide. I highly recommend a lot of her work, but this is a slide you might want to use if you need to persuade somebody about the degree of reliability of qualitative data. That degree increases as you start to see patterns. The patterns are dependent on getting deeper. You can't really develop empathy with people based on their opinions and their preferences. Okay, so a listening session. And I should start to try to wrap this up a little bit, but a listening session is how I do my data collection. And a listening session is a lot like going on a tour with a tour guide. I do not come at this with a list of questions. This is not an interview. This is me sitting down with someone and saying, okay, tell me what went through the mind the last time you did that thing. And let's just keep going through it and figuring out where all those pieces came from and why you're thinking these things, and explore the little byways that you bring up. It has nothing to do with what I'm interested in. So if I were on this tour here in this picture and I happen to have a love of church architecture, I would not interrupt the guide and ask her to explain the church architecture if she was not explaining it in the first place. So I do not introduce concepts to a listening session. And that's what's important about listening. We don't get taught listening in most of our schools, and it's a super needed skill. In fact, Julian Treasure has done a couple of TED Talks about it. I just posted I put it on the chat, and I also posted to Twitter another article that was on Being, Crystal Tippett, about the value of listening, and actually listening deeply, not listening with the idea of changing someone's mind, but just listening to really understand them and support them in their thinking. It's a lot like being a toddler. You all have probably encountered the toddler that asked why and then asked why again and then asked why again. Well, we don't want to be that annoying. But I think the key thing about a toddler is that they're not embarrassed about what they don't know. So I come to a listening session pretending I don't know anything about what the person is explaining to me so that I can keep myself asking about their thinking, and I'm not layering my own assumptions on top of it. So when somebody told me, oh, I didn't have an onion, so I substituted a leek, I'm like, oh, well, why is that? I mean, I know that they're both alliums and that you could substitute them, but I don't know the way I'm thinking is the same as the way she's thinking. So I'm asking her. Okay. So when you do a listening session, you just start with the thing that you want to explore, what went through your mind the last time you were trying to accomplish this purpose. And you try to stick with specific times to make it easier for someone to tell you what went through their mind, as opposed to generalizations, which can kind of get a little too vague, and it's harder for people to answer and tell you depth about that. Also use past tense to try to get past those generalities as well. And just follow the last few details. Pay explicit attention to what the person is saying. React to what the person is saying. Dig into it and be human and have a wonderful time. Also, it's a skill. It doesn't come for free. You have to practice it. Just like musicians and athletes practice. Think of times in your life where you're standing around what I call familiar strangers, and you could just start talking to them and see if you could make a listening session start to happen. This happens to be a line at a casual carpool pickup spot. You could do it when you're in line at the cafeteria, or all sorts of different places. I highly recommend that you try listening and you practice listening 4 times a week at least. Okay, so after the listening sessions, this is the mental model diagram, and that's the bottom thing right there, and the top thing is the audience segments. You notice that I don't give faces or like proper names, because those start giving you demographics, and then with the demographics come those assumptions. So I'm just trying to stay away from that. Again, this is being able to develop empathy. When you do this kind of work, I want to convey depth of data, and so I'm actually using spreadsheets to capture all the data, not sticky notes. But there is a light version of this that you can do that just uses sticky notes to capture things when you're working with your own team, or when you're working with co-creators as well. And then you go into something called combing and summaries. And this is, again, trying to re-understand what somebody is talking about. And actually, I just saw some news. I have this article up on my website right now. It's actually the one with the red background that shows up on the homepage that actually talks about this in a lot more depth. You'll want to look at that. You're combing through all of this data in depth and trying to really understand what that person meant and what intent they're trying to get out of it. And you're combining these things then up into patterns. So this is the part where you start finding patterns. This is the part where, like Brene Brown was talking about, this is where you have the validation of your data. If there's no patterns, you're not validating it. So here are some images of how I'm pulling the data together into little pieces, into little groups, and then those little groups start clinging together into bigger groups, and those bigger groups start clinging together into even bigger groups. So I build things from the bottom up, and that's what builds the top half of the mental model diagram. The bottom half is where you're aligning what your organization is doing in support of those top half towers. This is like a city skyline with a bunch of towers in it. So here you can see an example. We're zoomed way out, and you can see some things lined up underneath. You can also see a bunch of gaps. The gaps might be places where you don't want to get involved, or maybe those are some good opportunities. Here's some work that we're using sticky notes for the bottom half, and we're doing some analysis. So yes, you can still get back to your sticky notes. behavioral audience segments also, I think there's a few things to say there, and that is that there is no one group. It's more like episodic TV, where you've got sort of a set of characters for certain scenarios and another set of characters that show up in different scenarios. And it's so super important to remember that your behavioral audience segments, or you can call them personas if you want, are contextual. You cannot have like one persona to rule them all or one persona set to rule them all. It doesn't work. They have to be contextual. And I've written a very in-depth piece on Medium called Describing Personas that you might want to take a look at. Okay, so in summary, this is the two-cycle diagram. This is the idea of separating out this idea of mindfully understanding people, spending time with them. I happen to do it via listening sessions. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Ethnography is one. Actually, living with people is a great way to do it. Spending a lot of time in their world with them. It all depends on how much time you have and where you can access people. I highly encourage the more time you spend with people, the better it'll be. Okay, so there's the time for Q&A, not very much, but wanted to fit it in.
All right. Wow. There was so much in that, Indi. That's just been absolutely brilliant. I didn't want to stop you to come in and interrupt and tell you time's up. One of the benefits of the virtual rooms is that it's flexible and we don't have people standing outside the door waiting to get in. So we can take a little bit of time, but also being aware of your time limits. So you're getting a lot of props in the chat already. If you want to, everyone, you can use the applause button at the bottom of the participants list to actually give Indi a round of virtual applause.
Oh, that's hilarious. Does it actually show up audio?
Wouldn't it be good if it did do audio?
That's what I was expecting. Come on.
But pretty much across the board. So like I said,
plenty of time, so I'm happy to answer questions unless you need to move this room on.
No, we don't. We can keep this room going. We've got the open studio, which is happening next, and that'll be in a different room. So once people close out of here, they can move into the open studio with Spiros and Mark. And then at in about an hour from now, we're going to be back in this room to hear from Kim and Yona. So now, one of the people who's been most active in our conference so far is Maha Bali from Egypt, who is falling asleep because it's 2 a.m. So I'm going to give Maha the option of asking her question first. Maha, are you there?
Hi. Hi, Indi.
Hi, Maha. How are you?
How are you? Thanks for this wonderful, wonderful session. I'm going to listen to it again when I'm more awake, but it's already been amazing. And the question I posted already, I think you've read it. It's about the difference between empathy and participation. And I wrote a blog post and there was a discussion in the forum.
Yeah.
So if you want to speak a little bit more to that than you told me on Twitter.
Yeah. I tried to weave it in a little bit. I think participation and participatory design is fantastic. And you bring up a couple of really good places, like trying to understand people who you don't get into contact with a lot, or people who have thinking that's very different than your own. A couple of examples you brought up, Black Lives Matter. I guess that's maybe local to here, but being of a different ethnicity, or being Muslim, or being of a different religion. And I think that this is super key. Like I was mentioning, being able to spend time with people. Participatory design, though, is in that development cycle. And sure, when you are with people, any amount of time that you spend with people is good, whether you're doing design with them in the development cycle, or whether you're just sitting with them or living with them or following along or whatever, having a listening session in the problem space, or the understanding, the deep understanding that are intents and purposes. All of it is good. I think like I said, basically it's just mindfulness of where you are in using the vocabulary So using user in the design or the development process, using the word person in the problem space exploration. I don't think there's really more to say about that. Does that, I know it's 2 a.m. for you, so does that help, or is there any follow-on that you'd like?
Maha says yes, and thank you. Okay, and just a question, just as you were talking about the mental models, all of a sudden there were a lot of questions coming up around both how you go about doing that. There was a question from Yolanda Morkel, who asked about which software you use, and also a question from Jacqueline, who asked how long does it typically take to build a mental model like that, which you just showed us spans an entire room. How long does it take you to work on a project like that?
Sure. The software that I like to use is Excel, simply because I don't put any numbers in it. I just put all my qualitative data in there. So basically, I record every session that I have with people, whether you're in the field with them, whether you're just talking to them on the phone, wherever it is, record it, get transcripts. I've had people try to work just from the recordings. But when I'm doing it formally, a transcript really, really helps. Even when I'm doing it informally, a transcript really helps because I'll reread it. The second time you read it, you're going to get a much deeper understanding of what that person meant, as opposed to in the moment. You're going to remember the end of the conversation when you encounter something they said earlier and said, oh, that's what they meant. Now I get it, right? So I think a transcript is very important. The transcript then, when I'm doing it formally, is where I take little pieces of it and I put it into a spreadsheet and I summarize each little piece of it, each little concept. And then I start looking at those concepts across different voices. And I'm like, okay, are these concepts similar? No. How about that one? Is these concepts? Yeah, those go together. And I start doing affinity diagramming that way, just by putting piles and piles into the spreadsheet. These things can get, when I'm doing it formally, between 1,000 and 7,000 lines long. I start building them into bigger and bigger groups as the affinities build themselves. So I'm not coming at it where I say, oh, we're going to have a group called, here's how I cut things when I'm cooking, and a group called here's how I fry things when I'm cooking. No. It's based on the affinity and it moves up. There is, when I'm doing it formally, it all depends on how many people that we're talking to. 14 months for that airline thing, we talked to 100 different people. And with a lot of the ones I'm encountering now, a lot of more people are really interested in this, but they have to fight for budgets, so they get little tiny budgets. I'm like, okay, that's fine. Let's just listen to 10 people in one potential audience segment and try to get affinities out of that. And that can take, generally, because recruiting, finding people is difficult, I would say to expect 10 weeks for that. Right. Sometimes it can take up to 14 weeks. I've had these things go off the rails in terms of recruiting all the time. Now, this is doing it formally. If you want to do it informally, which I just did with a really large company, and we ended up with sticky notes at the end. This is just doing those sessions, getting the transcripts, rereading the transcripts, talking about the transcripts, and writing sticky notes together as a team. And again, you still have to face recruiting. You still have to get those transcripts made. And I think we did it in 8 weeks. Right. So yeah, logistics are the things that slow it down, but it isn't like those logistics are taking 100% of your time.
Yeah.
In fact, all of these are with people who have like 2 other projects running at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like we've got quite a lot of interest in that topic. So it might be something that we pick up, and we've got a few people who've actually run things, used different types of software, and who've run projects like that. So I think it's something we might dig into further over the next few days.
One of the things that I warn people about is don't let your software try to sort or make affinities for you. Software is not capable of that yet. It would be like asking your 2-year-old to do it. So don't expect the software to try to speed things up in terms of the affinity making.
That is very funny, because I think at the moment that's something that we really run into with the way that a lot of educational organizations use learning analytics, and they actually let the software do some of the talking for them. So good warning. All right. I'm just going to ask and see if there is maybe one last question before we let you go, because you've got a cold and you've been talking for a long time. So can we have a hand raise maybe, or maybe people can just drop their question?
In the chat.
Okay, I've got a question from Jeanette Benson, who had posted her question on the on your speaker page, in fact.
Okay.
And her question was, what do you think are the key points in ensuring that innovation is sustainable? The focus is often on the new idea, but however do we ensure that it is carried through to effective, sustained innovation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Shows some deep thought, and clearly someone has come up against some barriers, as we all have encountered. I think that the in the world that I'm in, it's all about trying to get to market and make money, which is this very capitalistic world. It might be slightly different in academia, yet money still sort of guides a lot of the decision making. So the sustainability, the way that I make that argument is, you know what, with our digital services, we are supporting, I would say, I don't know, 1 to 5% of all the potential human intents and purposes that are out there. And if you leave the other 95% on the table, someone else is going to come along and take that market. All it takes is some deep work, some deep understanding of how people are thinking as they achieve a purpose, to uncover a new way to support someone, or a new set of someone's, a new thinking style to support. Most of our digital services are one size fits all. It's meant to support everyone, and it doesn't work very well for anyone. So there is a lot of opportunity out there. So that is sustainable in terms of getting the funding for it. Yeah. I think there's also other interpretations of sustainable, like being able to keep doing it within your organization, or making it sustainable for that end audience. And I think
I think for certainly, so we've been doing a lot of work in higher education, the universities, and I think quite often innovation happens through project funding, and so there is innovation while the project funding lasts, and but it never gets embedded into the practice. And I think we need to be, if we get much more purposeful about how we design the business as usual, then we can also be much more purposeful about building innovation into that. But if you're always only tacking things on with temporary funding, then you're going to end up, that innovation is going to fall by the wayside, because it never actually gets to be seen as part of the overall service or part of the overall product. So it's an interesting space, and I was shaking my head vigorously just because Australian universities in particular have really moved into like a corporate type approach. So and I'm sure I'm stepping on toes saying that, but coming from Europe and then having worked in New Zealand as well, certainly the most corporate higher education I've ever been involved in. Yeah, so it's been really interesting.
So you've got a lot of those words. One more thing I want to say about that is another keyword is differentiate yourself. So that example that I gave about the agency, like IDEO having sort of this cycle running in the background all the time, so they could differentiate themselves to potential clients. This is also true of universities and educational facilities. You need to differentiate yourself so that the students keep coming. I've actually done a bunch of work with a consortium of community colleges and technical schools in one of the states, in one of the very poor states in the United States. And we were trying to understand how people make a decision to potentially pursue a degree, especially when they're coming from a a situation that this is not conducive to, financially conducive to it all. Didn't matter how old they are, didn't matter, what their background was necessarily. And it was really interesting to sort of see that and the desperation that the consortium themselves had to understand that and make use of it to try to pull more students in.
Yeah.
So that was a differentiator. I think that might be a good keyword to use. Yeah.
And if anyone's interested in that, the Teachers Guild, which was a co-project for schools in the US, but with IDEO, did a similar thing where they had like that thing running in the background. So, all right, I am going to thank you very much for getting us off with our first big idea. It was such a great start. And thank you so much. I'm sure this is going to prompt many conversations over the next few days. In fact, I'm going to charge Jill and Yolanda, who've been talking about research and how to do it, with setting up a forum for us to actually start talking about that. But I want to thank you very much for sharing your expertise, and I'll be sure to stay in touch. But thank you so much. Yeah. And just a big round of applause from all of us here.
Great. Happy to help, and feel free to use all of my resources. One of the things I'm really interested in doing is helping by providing all of this. There's a ton of stuff for free out there that you guys can use and that you can use to point to when there are doubting Thomases.
Fantastic. As there will be. So on that note, thank you so much. For those people who are moving into the open studio, you just use the little door icon on the top right and you can leave this session. I am going to stop the recording now.